Get going?
Might
Sure,
as well.
yeah, I
All
started
right.
recording.
All right. Great. So basically, what I'm going to be talking about today is kind of a big picture group of ideas that I've been thinking about. And they really started, I think this is kind of unique from a young researcher's perspective. And they started because, so I study the climate, and I was looking at all of these research results in various subdomains of the climate system. And I was like, man, there's so much amazing work being done in all of these little pieces of the climate system, you know, clouds, plants. But then I was like, you know, what do all these, you know, great results, like, what do they really mean for the broader system's behavior? And I wasn't really sure. And I was like, okay, you know, this is just because I'm a young researcher. You know, I don't have the knowledge, maybe I don't have the skills to put all of this together. And hopefully someday I get these skills. But then as I started to dig into this problem a little bit more, I started to think, you know what, maybe this problem is actually a little bit more ubiquitous. And, you know, maybe there are some missing pieces that we have in our research community that are kind of not letting this synthesis of all of this knowledge happen. And I'm freely, you know, I think it's very likely that I'm wrong, and, you know, really this is just a me problem, and I don't have the skills. But at least for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to make an argument that we need some framework, and we need some tools to consolidate and kind of collaborate on all of this climate knowledge. And, you know, we're engineers here, so it's not all about, you know, like moaning about problems. You know, we also want to talk about solutions, and I have a proposed solution. It's kind of in its infancy, and you know, I think to keep in 20 minutes, I'm not going to be able to really talk about that. I want to make sure the problem is defined in all of its nuance. But for the discussion period, please, like, I would love to talk about this solution, how it works, and my ideas about it. So if anyone has any questions about the solution side, please ask them. I even have some slides that I could go into. Okay, so I think to like really get into what do we need for synthesizing climate knowledge, we got to have some common, you know, base understanding, common understanding of the climate system. And for me, the climate system, it really breaks down to coupling between energy, carbon, and water. And I think this diagram is a really nice idea because, you know, we're in environmental engineering, and we have people working on all different things, a huge diversity of research projects. But I think in some ways, you know, this diagram kind of unites us, that no matter what we're studying, if it's man-made systems or whatever, like a lot of our research has something to do with either energy, carbon, or water, or some coupling between them or something. Like, I'm sure if we audited all of the papers we've put out as a department over the last 20 years, the vast majority of them would include one or many of these keywords. So it's a nice idea. It's like a unifying premise for our department. I'm not sure this like beautiful diagram, extremely sophisticated, creative diagram does the idea justice, but I think it's a nice idea. And so in the natural system, in the climate system, we're interested in the same coupling. And this coupling is really going to involve the ocean, the atmosphere, and the biosphere, and interactions between all of these things. And those interactions are very complicated. It's a complex system. And I think people can, you know, just throw out that word and say, oh, it's a complex system, and the buck stops there. But it's important for the arguments I'm going to be making that we really understand the depth of that complexity. So I'm going to take us on a little video tour of the climate system. Can people still see my screen?
Yes.
Great. All right. So these are satellite imagery. So this is all going to be looking down, put out by Colorado State. I mean, I could lose myself for days in these videos, and I encourage you to do as well. But for now, I'm just going to focus on one example. So here we're looking at clouds. So these are low clouds over the ocean, and we have some high clouds over here. And I think the complexity is kind of self-evident, you know, right? We can see all these complex motions in here. And one thing I want to just draw attention to for those that may not be aware is that these clouds are very important for the climate system. So They reflect solar radiation back to space, so that's the energy component. They can also trap terrestrial radiation at the surface, also the energy component. And then obviously they're made up of water, so the water cycle's there, and clouds are necessary, you know, for creating rain, which is water going into the surface. And what's important to note is that even with all of this complexity that we have here, if we were to continue zooming in on this picture, like pick a pixel and keep zooming in on it, we would continue to see more and more and more complexity. So even this image does not capture all the complexity we have. And you know, I didn't pick this example on accident. So if we start at the beginning, you can see these kind of linear features here. And these get at like some of this small scale complexity. So these are actually they're called ship tracks. And what you have in the ocean is you have ships going around and they put out some pollution, which are basically, you know, like small particles that are floating in the atmosphere. We call those aerosols. And those aerosols can preferentially cause water vapor droplets to condense and form clouds. So you can see that here, that like this is micrometer scale behavior is manifesting itself in the large scale flow with these ship tracks. And then I think this example is also nice because at the other hand, we also see, you know, humans are very much a part of the system, and we are modulating how the system behaves in like concrete, visible ways, which is nice. And then just for one last go, like we can play and we can see, yes, you know, these plume or these ship tracks, you know, then they start interacting with the flow, they start broadening, some of them disappear. And, you know, I mean, the takeaway is just, this is complex. It's very complex. So if we go back to the presentation, so that's just the atmosphere piece. It also interacts with the ocean. And I'm not an oceanographer, so a lot of what I say here might not be right. But hopefully it's get close to right. So this is a video by Ryan Abernathy, who's here at Columbia. He's at Lamont. And this is an ocean simulation. So up here we have the surface. You see all these complicated circulations. You see these vortices interacting with the circulation. And then down here we see, so this is a slice moving down in the ocean, and what's shown is vertical velocities. And you can see all this really complicated structures in the vertical velocity field. Let's watch that again. And what's important about that is that the ocean is a source and a sink for both energy and carbon. I mean, these days it's mostly a sink for both energy and carbon. And a lot of that sink is going to be modulated by the vertical motions and the vertical fluxes. And so we need to understand all of that complexity in order to say, okay, how much carbon is the ocean taking up? How much energy is the ocean taking up? And within that system, there's also some added complexity. You have an ocean biosphere, and those currents can bring up nutrients that can drive organic uptake of carbon from the atmosphere. So again, really complicated system with a lot of nuance, and we need to appreciate this nuance. Lastly, we have the biosphere. And so I'm gonna go to this video. So again, this is satellite imagery looking at kind of global scale biosphere, and you can see, like, you know, obviously a ton of complexity. And you see, like, for example, in the high latitudes, this very strong seasonal cycle. With the growing season, you know, that's uptake and release of carbon on the seasonal cycle. You can see also other complicated features, you know, the expansion and contraction of the Sahara into the Sahel. And I think what's really interesting is if you zoom in on the tropics, you know, for example, like the Amazon, the maritime continent over here, you see a lot of variability that might not be completely tied to a seasonal cycle. And this is really important for the climate system and the broader carbon cycle, because the tropics can store and release a ton of carbon in these tropical rainforests. So understanding this is really important. Like the cloud example, if we I missed the start. Hold on, let me rewind. So if we zoom in, we see additional complexity. And actually, I couldn't find a great video to show this, but I think this will do. So this is going to show a fire. So we see a fire move through the underbrush, and then the plants start to regrow. And as they regrow, plants are interacting and competing with each other, kind of within an environment that's dictating that competition. So that's kind of imposed by the atmosphere. And at the same time, these plants are actually modifying the environment by regulating water from the surface. And just like in the cloud example, I really want to hammer this home that if you were to zoom in on any one of these plants, you would continue to see more and more complexity. So plants on their leaves, they have little tiny stomata that open and close, and those stomata directly regulate both how much water the plants are giving up and how much carbon they're taking in. And those stomata are again like micrometer scale, so tiny scale. So you can keep zooming and zooming and zooming, and there'll be more and more complexity. So back to the presentation. I'll try to go full screen again. So yeah, the climate system's complex, and I hope that we kind of, instead of just saying it's complex, we have some common knowledge of just the depth of this complexity. And to understand the system, we need to understand the pieces. And this is not just like some hyperbole. It's oh, sorry, hold on. We got a video playing in the background. Freaked me out. So this is not, like I think a lot of people who study like multi-scale systems, they say, okay, yeah, maybe we need to understand the pieces, but all those small scale pieces, there's going to be some emergent behavior and the details will just wash out and we don't really need to handle them. But that's not really the case with the climate system. So the climate system, for example, like clouds have a brightness that directly relates to like the mean climate, where energy is being absorbed in the atmosphere and at the surface. But that brightness is like not almost like a one-to-one correspondent with what's going on at that micrometer scale, how those tiny little particles are having water condensed onto them and how they're interacting. So it's not like we don't need to worry about the details, like we do. And I think another example that I just talked about is the stomata. Like a change in those stomata opening and closing to release water, like changes the fundamental energy partitioning at the land surface and affects our mean climate state. So like a little change in that micrometer behavior it corresponds to like an equal change in your near surface temperature. So we can't just sweep them under the rug with some emergent behavior. And so I'm also going to say, to understand these pieces, we need specialized researchers, right? So like that domain experts who's making progress on how water or cloud droplets are forming and interacting, they have developed years of tools and knowledge to push that cutting edge forward. But that same person, if they wanted to say, I think stomata are also really important and plants are really important, they would not be able to go and switch and make progress studying the stomata and the plants. Like that is a completely different set of skills and information. So we need specialized researchers and reductionist research approaches. There's no way around that. So I think the challenge then is, how do we tie all the domain research together for some climate system understanding and prediction? And when I was first thinking about all this and wondering, like, is this just a me problem? I was like, okay, well, how do we do that now? And particularly looking at the future climate, which I think is important for mitigation. And the answer is that we use Earth system models. And I think there are some community reasons why Earth system models have kind of developed into this somewhat monoculture for studying the future climate. And I'd be happy to talk about those in the discussion, but like they are basically the tool that's used prevalently. And so what these Earth system models do is they basically explicitly simulate through numerical integration the equations of motion in the atmosphere and the ocean. And the way they do that is they break up the world into a grid. So here we have a grid, and the problem is the climate system's so big that this grid is relatively coarse. So the Earth system models, they can only explicitly represent like motions that are about 4 times the size of a grid cell here. So big motions. So they can't represent all those details that we were just seeing in that video. They can't explicitly simulate them. But the way they've gotten around that is they say, okay, well, within a given grid cell, we can't explicitly simulate clouds or plants or all these things, but let's try to approximate them with some simplified representation. And these simplified representations are called parameterizations. And these parameterizations are kind of like the way some of this domain research makes it into Earth system models. And these parameterizations, they lead to errors because they're inherently, approximations. But the problem, and I want to hammer home, like these are system models. One, they're extreme technical achievements, and we should appreciate them as that. And two, the problem is not that they have approximations, right? Like to study such a multi-scale system, we need to make approximations of some scale. So that's not the issue. But what I'm going to argue is that, maybe Earth system models, for how amazing they are, and like maybe though they have a weakness when it comes to this goal of incorporating new domain research, right? Like all this cutting edge research on clouds, like maybe that's not their strength. Maybe their strength is not being on the bleeding edge of all of that. And so to actually like not just make this an abstract idea, I think it's important to do a little exercise. So here we are. So we're in my text editor. So this is actually code in a cutting edge Earth system model, the community Earth system model. And I want us to just put ourselves in the shoes of somebody who is a researcher. Let's say they work on cloud microphysics. They're an expert. They do both lab experiments with their group, and they also go out and do field campaigns and take measurements. And they've developed all this expertise around lab experiments and field campaigns. And they come up with some new amazing result, and they're like, you know what? This changes how we thought about microphysics. Like, let's add this new idea into an Earth system model. And they're like, I'm gonna put this into the ESM parameterization. So this is, this is the parameterization for microphysics. And then they start scrolling through. So now we're scrolling through and they're like, wow, this is a whole other world of technical computing. We have variable names, AR, BR. We have all of these variable declarations. We're still in variable declarations. I know nothing about scientific computing. Still variable declarations. Now we're getting into like an imperative procedure, nested for loops, nested if loops, all of these things. And if you're, and we're still going, but if you're those in that domain researcher's shoes, you're going to say, there's this huge technical barrier to my contribution. Am I going to spend the next year learning how to make this one module? Or am I going to get back out, make some exciting results on my field campaigns and help manage my lab? And I think for a lot of people, this technical barrier is just too large for them to contribute. And I think this is compounded by some community dynamics that I'd love to talk about in the discussion. But I think the technical one is a big one. And I don't want this to be interpreted at all as like me throwing some like bad energy towards climate models. Like they are a great tool. And I don't know much about scientific computing, but I imagine this code looks the way it does because of the tool that GCMs were made for. And that is numerically integrating as much of the motions in the climate system as we can. And so to meet that tool, performance is key. So this code looks the way it is because performance is the driver of Earth system model development. But basically what I'm saying is that makes it not the tool for synthesizing domain research, or maybe not the best tool. It is still a tool. So I don't want this to be interpreted as some criticism of Earth system models. For me, this comes down to the right tool for the job. Okay, so now I'm actually, yeah. So this is my opinion, but I think hopefully I've made an argument that there's some missing piece in the climate community, and that is synthesizing domain research into some constraints on climate system behavior and understanding. So where do we go from here? We don't want to just be all about the problem. So I have a proposed solution. I call it the communal climate machine, and it's a very lame name. So please, also, if anybody has like an idea for a better name, give me it and I will change it willingly. So, but the overarching goal for this system is it's got to be easy, positive, and rewarding for domain researchers across the climate system to contribute to. So we want to remove technical and community barriers to contributions. And that's the goal, but there are some parameters on that goal. So we want any contribution to the system to still interact with all the other pieces of the climate system in some way that's kind of faithful to how those nonlinear actions actually behave in the real world. So we still need to have the interacting piece is what's important. And to kind of like summarize the goal in picture form, like if this is maybe how the domain researcher felt being confronted by all this technical scientific computing Fortran code, we want them to feel a little bit, more like this, where they're hitting the waves in Waikiki. And I put this slide, or I added these pictures late last night, and it makes me realize that I am slowly becoming my grandmother, which is okay, which is great. So yeah, that's the goal, like make it fun. We want a domain researcher, they finish their new domain result from their field campaign or their lab work, and they're like, you know what, maybe even before they finish writing the paper, they're like, I can't wait to add this to the communal climate machine. It's going to be easy, and then I get to see how did my research further constrain the climate, or maybe it supported all the research that's already out there, or maybe it creates some crazy controversy where it contradicts a bunch of existing research. And that's great because all of the high impact journals like Science and Nature love controversial results. So like we'll get that. So that's kind of the goal we're after for the communal climate machine. So like I'm up against 20 minutes, so I'm just going to summarize mostly just the problem. So the climate system is really complicated and it's really diverse, both with the fields that are involved, ecology, biology, microphysics, dynamics, all of these things. And then also the scale, so from micrometer scale to tens of thousands of kilometers. And because of that, we need specialized researchers to understand the climate process. And the problem is like right now, we don't really have a way of taking all of that progress in research and synthesizing it into some constraint on the system behavior. So that's what I kind of see as a void. And I'm working on a proposed solution, which is the communal climate machine. So I'll take questions, and I would love to have like a discussion to give ideas for anybody if they are thinking of things to maybe discuss. So, I mean, one option, like we can just go back and look at satellite videos and just zone out and just like meditate on the complexity of the system. I would love to do that. I could describe some more about, I didn't really talk at all about like the communal climate machine's design. I could do some code demos, which might be very exciting because usually when I do this live, they go horribly wrong. I could talk about how this relates to my research. This is kind of outside of my doctoral dissertation, but there are some relationships. Plans for the near future, far future. We could have like a nice discussion about like community dynamics, how incentives in academia have kind of led to the current state of climate research. I am up for anything. And yeah, I'll be happy to take questions now.
You don't have any questions in the chat. So just as a reminder for everyone, you could send them through the chat or unmute yourself.
Great. Yeah, hopefully.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
Very nice presentation, by the way. I congratulate you on this. It's a comment and a question. In our field, right, I'm in the resource development, earth resources, and we deal with the same thing, and I've written several articles on this, why people are not able to synthesize all these multiple studies that, what I call parts, studies of the parts, and I even give the example of describing an elephant. Nobody seems to start with an elephant and understand the various parts. Rather, they prefer to work on and describe the parts of the elephant very well, but the parts don't add up to an elephant. And I think this was mentioned in a very nice essay that was written in 1963. It was called Chaos in the Brickyard. People love to work on the bricks, perfect them, but not the edifice. So you're dealing with that. But my question is, it's a bit surprising. Of course, our systems are also complex and there are emergent behaviors. It's easy to work on the parts. It's very difficult to work with the complex system. They just think that they're very difficult to work with and difficult to understand. But my question to you is, climate science, of course, is much bigger. Why do you think, what are the reasons that people are not able to synthesize, if that is indeed the case? Because I don't know much about this, at least I can speak for my own field. Why do you think that is? What are the problems?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of really great points here. So I agree, like there needs to be, if everybody's working on their own pieces, that those pieces might not add up to the whole. And so, so I think the focus of my presentation, a lot of it was on those small scale pieces and how we can synthesize them, because I see that as a void in the climate research. But I think there's another version of this presentation that could have been from the opposite perspective, that it says, and this is honestly kind of more my perspective, because I think I am more interested in kind of the system behavior, that takes the perspective of I am starting from the system and I want to understand how that works. And what's nice about the communal climate machine, which it's tricky. I actually don't really know how to balance like diving into the design of it. So I hope I don't miss this balance. But the communal climate machine is, it's kind of designed for the people that are doing the specific research to contribute their ideas to, but it's also designed to be managed by the systems people. So to maybe use the elephant analogy, a systems person might say, okay, we're looking at the elephant system behavior, and I'm going to start with how the elephants are doing migration or whatever, or how an individual elephant interacts with another elephant. And so I'm going to start drawing out an idea in terms of variables and how they relate to each other of that system behavior. And communal climate machine is basically designed to do that. So the systems level person is sketching out kind of what are the pieces that matter for the macro scale behavior. And then I think what the communal climate machine adds is it's really easy for the domain, or the goal is for it to be really easy for the domain researcher to then tie in and say, okay, that piece X, I studied that, here's my contribution, that's how that is constrained. And as those constraints get added, the system is propagating the new kind of small scale constraints according to the structure that the systems level researcher imposed in the system. And so, to me, I think I view communal climate machine as kind of a bridge between the systems macro scale and the smaller scale. And I think the reason this is a problem in the climate community, getting back to that part of the question, the problem, it really, I think to me is in a nutshell, like kind of not the only, but the primary overwhelmingly popular tool that we're using right now to have this dialogue between small scale and macro scale behavior are Earth system models. And these Earth system models are basically filtering out, who can be a part of that dialogue. And a lot of that filter comes from this technical background that you need to have to contribute to them. That is, for a lot of domain experts, it's completely orthogonal to anything else that they're working on. And so communal climate machine kind of tries to address the problem, because I do kind of view that as a big issue. I would also say, maybe getting a little more philosophical, like what is the systems-wide behavior and what is the small-scale behavior is completely relative. And so hopefully communal climate machine can kind of represent this small-scale similarity where everybody can both, as a user, you're viewing this as the systems level behavior, and as a contributor, you're kind of contributing to the small scale behavior. But that small scale behavior for someone else might be the macro scale. To really kind of capture this spectrum where one person's macro is another micro, and another person's micro is another macro, but we're letting them all interact and inform each other.
Mm-hmm. Very good.
Adam, we have a couple questions in the box, chat box.
Great.
So
let me try to pull up.
I could ask, I could share it, read it for you if you'd like.
That'd be great. Yeah. I don't know if I
yeah,
can figure
sure.
out how to bring up the chat box.
Of course. No, I have it for you. So the first one is, I don't know too much about you, so can you tell us something about your background and thesis plans?
Yes. So I'm a fourth year PhD student. I'm advised by Professor Gentine. My undergraduate was in civil engineering, and I was doing a lot of work then with land surface processes. I was looking at like snow hydrology. Then I got a master's degree at SUNY Albany, and that was atmospheric science. So I was looking at mountain weather, cloud microphysics, and precipitation. And then here at Columbia, my goal is to kind of synthesize this land surface perspective and this atmosphere perspective to understand how they're coupled. And I think hopefully this background kind of fits in with the communal climate machine, where, you know, trying to understand how things are coupled and how systems relate to each other. And maybe building on that a little bit more. So how this relates to like my dissertation research. So to be honest, this has been kind of like a hobby of mine. But it relates, so my dissertation is on understanding how aridity develops in the boundary layer. Kind of the first piece I was looking at how plants regulate moisture. And Pierre and I put together some cool results on that. But now we want to say, okay, what are the consequences for kind of this one-way response of plants to the atmosphere for like how aridity just develops in the boundary layer, basically where humans live. And so to do that, I'm working on like a constraint-based framework where we're synthesizing a bunch of research results, including my own. And so that actually fits in with the communal climate machine. So that's what the development has been focused on, is basically using it for this very narrow problem in the climate system that does have a lot of the components of the broader system. So it has the biosphere and it has the clouds. And I think this is going to be important to the communal climate machine success, is that we're starting grounded in applications on some tractable problem. So like, it's not like we're going to build this crazy tool and then be like, wait, what was it we're trying to answer again? From the beginning, it's going to be based on applications. But as I'm developing the system, somewhat, you know, so there's the part that's applied to my research, and then there's the part that's the hobbyist side. And the hobbyist side is, you know, in the evenings after I'm done with my research, I'll be like, okay, what did I do today for the boundary layer, and how might I be able to tweak this and make it generalizable to the whole climate system? So that's kind of, so as I'm building this for my research, I have an eye towards the entire climate system. And I've started to kind of develop it in such a way that it hopefully will scale. And then I'm trying to find some postdoctoral funding for after I graduate, where I can maybe get some computer science skills and collaborations that I think are going to be important, right? At some point, we're going to run into a problem of how does this scale, and what are the approximations we might need to build into the system to help it scale, both across the climate community, the research, but then also across the climate system in terms of what it's representing. Sorry, that was a very long answer to what's my background.
That was great. Thank you, Adam. So another question is, someone commented in the chat box, thank you so much for the presentation, Adam. My question is the hindrance in adding new information to a global climate model a relic of iterative model building across generations of scientists, or due to the chaotic nonlinear nature of the field?
So I think this is a great question. All these questions have been great. This is also a great question. So I don't think it's my perspective. So I think this is very subjective and almost kind of philosophical. I think my perspective is, I don't think it has a lot to do with the fact that the system's nonlinear. I think it being nonlinear presents challenges, and I think it can kind of play a role in the sense, like, one challenge of a nonlinear system is we want to represent that nonlinearity. And I think through the way our education system is structured right now, you know, the ways we represent nonlinearity or we study nonlinear systems is a lot of times with numerical integration. And so I think in that sense, the nonlinear nature of the system has maybe contributed not so much to the bottleneck of contributions to GCMs, but has contributed to us being like, GCMs or Earth system models are the tool that we use. You know, like it's like, okay, we need to study this climate system. It's a nonlinear system. It evolves due to some initial conditions and due to some boundary conditions. And I think our mind just goes to, okay, we need to numerically integrate the equations of motion. So I think the nonlinear aspect is why we use Earth system models. I think the why there's a bottleneck is primarily the technical legacy, what the question answer was asking for the first bit, like this technical legacy of developing Earth system models and the importance of it being high performance. So Fortran is still a very high performance language. There's also this long history of using Fortran going back to the 70s in science. There's a lot of legacy code that's written in Fortran. So there is this tremendous community inertia to keep, in the modeling community, to keep things in Fortran. But at the same time, we've developed, you know, kind of, I think the way scientists learn how to, if they need to use code in their domain, how to use code is usually different languages. And those like Python or Julia or MATLAB, and the skills developed in using those languages don't necessarily translate to contributing to high performance numerical Fortran code. So to me, the bottleneck on the technical side is related to this legacy effect. And there are people who are working on ways of making Earth system models not reliant on Fortran code. And I think those are commendable, really commendable efforts. And I look forward to seeing where they go. I think this is like saying like, maybe we can take an idea of accessibility of contribution to an extreme and see where that takes us and really see what's this system we develop when we remove these bottlenecks. There's also community elements that I've been rambling on, so I'm not going to talk about. I'll talk about those if someone else asks about what are the community bottlenecks to contributions to Earth system models.
Okay, great. So I'll go to the next question. We have Sarah Hamilton, who said, really cool talk, Adam. Potentially naive question. I know almost nothing about climate modeling, but have you done a pilot test of the current communal climate machine design, say with your group or collaborators? If so, what lessons have you learned, or how can you integrate those in your design?
Yeah, so also great question. I have not, and I have not done any pilot project comparisons. And I think kind of the question brings up at a point that because I didn't get a lot of time to talk, or I didn't put a lot of time towards talking about like what the communal climate machine actually is, there could be ambiguity about where it's at right now. So where it's at is it's a framework that I'm using for my current research, but it's really just in its infancy. So it hasn't been scaled up to the climate system, and even within my own research, it's very much in like a debugging phase of seeing like, okay, I'm taking this completely new approach, maybe just to like have a figure of like what this looks like. So this is just like, so this is like a toy example. Well, it's not a toy example. It's a real example, but it's a very narrow example. This is me encoding research results with Pierre that we had into the communal climate machine. And basically the communal climate machine internally is this network of all of these variables that are all uncertain, and domain experts can say there's constraints between variables, and the code I've been working on basically propagates information around these constraints in such a way that that the entire system is constrained. So it's a very different approach to the climate, to the Earth system model approach. That said, I think it's one that is very interesting to compare down the line as it grows. But I think when that comparison's done, there's two things. So one that's important is that, and this gets back to the right tool for the job. So like the communal climate machine is never going to be able to replace climate models, because it's never going to be capable of like large scale numerical integration or like large scale data analysis. What it can do is it can use results from numerical integration or use results from large scale data analysis into a constraint. So like an example of this is like the communal climate machine might not be able to analyze terabytes or petabytes of data, but let's say someone else goes and does that and they fit some neural network to some data set to make some prediction. And that neural net has some inputs and some outputs. The communal climate machine is perfect for this scenario because you can encode that neural net into the communal climate machine as some constraints between the inputs and the outputs. So we basically add arrows. And then as we run the network's answers or solutions to queries are going to be faithful to that constraint. So even though the communal climate machine is not analyzing terabytes and petabytes of data itself, the information from that analysis is still in the network and is still represented. Sorry, this is like a complete tangent. But so to get back to like the comparison with Earth system models, I think we can do a comparison, but I think the more interesting thing, and again, this gets back to I was focusing on more of the domain science side, but we can actually encode Earth system model results into the network. And the really interesting thing that happens when we start to do that, this is talking way down the line. This is like five or 6 years down the line. But when we start to do that, we can start to use the system to say, okay, we added some Earth system model results. What are the ways in which the Earth system model results contradict some of the domain research that's already been encoded in the network? And then we can resolve that contradiction. So we can say, okay, maybe this requires a lot of times clarifying assumptions behind the Earth system model or behind domain results. Maybe it involves falsifying domain results. Maybe some domain results we thought were true are actually not true. Or maybe we just need to improve the GCM to make it more consistent with this domain knowledge. So in that way, we can guide GCM development. I think there's another way we can guide Earth system model development. Like let's say somebody makes some domain science breakthrough. It gets incorporated into the communal climate machine. And it turns out that that contribution really constrains climate behavior. So then we can say, okay, hey, Earth system model developers, look, like this domain result really strongly constrains the system. So let's prioritize incorporating this domain result and translating it into that dense Fortran code that we use in Earth system model development. So in that way, the system, the communal climate machine can improve Earth system models. But then because those Earth system models are also, those results are being put back into the network in the communal climate system, we benefit from the Earth system model. So like the piece to hammer home with this proposal is that the communal climate machine does not replace any other tool, and all of these existing tools we have are great. They're amazing tools. And I don't want to take anything away from any of them. What the communal climate system does is it benefits from these other tools. So it's not replacing tools, it's benefiting from them. And it's saying, okay, this is like a computational, or not even a computational, a computer tool to synthesize all these things. So I think this is a long way of saying, I think comparisons are going to be important, but what's nice is that in some ways, the communal climate machine is a tool for doing comparisons in a very sophisticated, nuanced way that I haven't been able to really dive into. And I might have dropped the ball. Maybe I should have just explained what this is and how it works a little bit more. Yeah. Hello? I think I lost people.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, that's all the questions in the chat box.
Cool, great.
Yes.
Well, if anybody has any other questions or, you know, voice questions or whatever, I'm happy to take them. I don't even know what time it is. Oh, quarter till. Yeah, so I'll stick around if people got questions. It looks like we have a question from Ray.
Yeah, Adam, a very nice talk. I appreciate how you pulled this together. To do a bank shot off of Professor Nagaraj's questions, we deal with these Earth systems and a level of complexity, and I'm wondering if, you know, graphical user interfaces have been used in data acquisitions to put together, let's call them virtual instruments, for example, to analyze input signals and massage them to give outputs. And all of this is, you know, C++ code and Fortran code underneath, and stringing together of subroutines based on those computer languages. And I'm wondering if something like that would even be possible for what you're suggesting. In other words, if there was an architecture at a high enough level of granularity, let's say, that one could work on a, you know, bit of domain expertise knowledge and just wire that in. Something like that would make the barrier quite low or lower for somebody to at least add that information.
Yeah, this is a great comment, great question. So you're 100% right. So the user interface is, to me, it is like the most important aspect of the communal climate machine. And I think a GUI, GUI could 100% be the way to go. So you know, what I envision is like, yeah, so some domain research scientists, they finish their result and they say, okay, like I'm gonna go into this GUI, and maybe they need to just write like a math expression, and that could be in LaTeX or whatever, like, or just, you know, simple 2 times 3 whatever plus underlying water use efficiency. We ingest that into the system, and then we put that in as a constraint, and maybe derive some other constraints, which are these edges in this diagram here. And so as I've been putting this system together initially, I've had my eye very much on this user interface, and I really do. I mean, I view it as the bottleneck. Like, if someone can just go to a website and type something in, they're going to do it. And if they have to learn a bunch of stuff, that they're not going to do it. So maybe it's worth it to just briefly kind of look at how it's done now, which is not a GUI yet, but I think it's a step in the right direction, hopefully. So so actually, sorry, I'm going to go. So first, so this is kind of an example system that we've been working on. Actually, sorry, I'm kind of jumping around here. First, let's just look at a macro scale system of how the communal climate machine is currently working. And so right now, user contributions are in Markdown format. So there's no writing of code. For those that aren't familiar with Markdown, it's basically like a plain text document format. And I'll show you an example in just a second. So the contributor will write down like a function in Markdown, or they'll write down a constraint on a variable. And that constraint will be like, okay, we believe this variable is we believe that evapotranspiration is between 100 watts per meter squared and 200 watts per meter squared, if these other things are true. And the way the system works, so we take this Markdown, we parse it. We're using, so any box in this diagram that's blue is something I've written myself, but I try to use tools that already exist. So we parse this using Pandoc, which is a Haskell tool. Haskell is a computer language. Then I parse the Pandoc output. There's one piece that compiles like any functions that were in that input into SymPy code, which is a computer algebra system written in Python. We generate some SymPy code. We run the SymPy code, produce some output, and then we parse that SymPy output using Haskell. We combine it with the raw Markdown, and this compiler is both written in Haskell and it compiles to Haskell code. So the communal climate machine is written in Haskell. And so this workflow is kind of what you're describing, where as far as the contributor is concerned, everything is in Markdown. And then we have, you know, your example is C++ and Fortran. Instead of C++, I'm using Haskell, but apples and oranges, doesn't really matter. And we have all these technical details that the maintainer has to worry about, but not the contributor. And I think that's important. And so to look at, like, at least now, and I think you bring up a good point of like some kind of GUI, I think would be the ultimate way to go. Now it's Markdown. So if you want to look at what that contribution would look like now. So this is an example of a Markdown file. And this is on GitHub. So this is a part of the communal climate machine. So Markdown is a plain text format, but you have these nice automatic pretty ways of rendering it. So this is on GitHub. And so this is a functional constraint. And it's not completely non-technical, but if you were a user, if you were a contributor, this is just Python, a Python function. And it's trivial for me to write a different parser that would just parse a simple math expression where you have variable names and things like that. So if you're a contributor, basically all you have to do is write a function. You can optionally, but I think down the line we could make this a requirement. So you can optionally add notes about units. So we say ET is in units of watts per meter squared, which is nice. And then we say, and this is not something I think I have time to go into, but the system manages qualitative information. So it manages assumptions and premises behind any contribution. So we can also add a premise to our contribution where we say, okay, the premise here we're going to call is Pendon-Monteith. And when we have that premise on a value, it's saying we believe Pendon-Monteith is true. And this is just, it's a theory for, an energy balance theory for how ecosystems behave. So if a contributor wants to make a contribution, all they do, and they can do this on the web using GitHub, they can click edit and they can change their result, or they can add a new function. So adding a new function, you would just delete this and then you would type some new function. So let's say we want to type a function where we say force is equal to mass times acceleration. That would be it. They would save the changes, commit changes, and now it's in the communal climate system. So then it's just a matter of me pulling down the new version of the communal climate system onto my computer. This is all automatically rerun. We reparse that new Markdown, and we compile it to Haskell, and we have a new version of the communal climate machine that has that new contribution that we all saw that I just added right now. So this is a low barrier to contribution. I think a GUI is definitely the way to go in the end. Just a couple, since we're here, just a couple of features I think that are important. You know, so I said the goal was for it to be easy. Hopefully it's relatively easy now, and rewarding. And I think rewarding, what's nice is that with this plain text format, we can add metadata. So you can add a citation. So you know, Monteith here, they get credit for this constraint being in the communal climate machine. So if you're a domain researcher, you are motivated. It is rewarding to contribute to the communal climate machine because you get credit for this.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
And the system, which I haven't really been able to talk about, but because it propagates, so with any given value, it propagates this information around. And so when you get a result, we'll know that it was dependent on this. And so that adds kind of another level of complexity to getting credit for your work. So maybe I'll just really quick. Sorry, I'm talking so long, but we were getting the wrong question. So this is an example on the user side of what the communal climate system looks like. So you basically query it and you use some qualitative information to query. So right now, Massmann scenario is just like some boundary conditions from a paper of me and Pierre. And then you can't, I don't know if you can see it, but the screen share blocks it on my screen, but then believed premises, that's a set of assumptions that we believe. So we query the system, and then we can say, okay, what's the value we get for ET from that query? And And it spits back, okay, we say, given these assumptions that I haven't really elaborated on, if we believe those, the value of ET is between 47 and 247 watts per meter squared. But because the system is also propagating qualitative information along with values, we can also say, okay, what are the premises behind that estimation? And we get a list here. And you see here, we have Penman-Monteith. So we're saying this result is dependent on that. So that adds another level to the reward, because then when you're writing a paper from the user side of using the communal climate machine, you can say, oh, I know this Penman-Monteith, like that was something my results depended on. Let's cite that paper and let's give them credit for the constraint they've contributed to our research, which is nice.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, there's a lot more you can do with these premises as well.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, sorry if that was long-winded. I don't know this balance between showing how it actually
passionate
works.
about it. That's good.
Yeah. Showing how it works and answering questions is a delicate balance.
Well, thank you. This has been wonderful. I know it's 1:57 now, so being aware of everyone's time, I don't know if you have any last words or if anybody else has any final comments or questions.
I do not have any last words at all. I would just like to thank everybody for their time and for all the great questions. I really appreciate it. Maybe if there's any professors around, if anybody's interested in this, let me know. So I'm putting together my perspectives committee right now. This presentation was a small part of that, but like, if this is interesting to you, please reach out to me. And also anyone else, students, otherwise, like if any of this is interesting, you know, I love collaboration, chatting about this kind of stuff. So yeah, let me know. I'm around. I'm not going anywhere, hopefully. So yeah.
Well, thanks again, Adam, and thank you everyone for joining us. Okay, I guess that's a wrap. Well,
all right, thanks all.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Have a good weekend, everybody.